Hello and welcome to episode 6 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast where I speak to the authors of some of our most talked about recent pieces. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Coming up this week, I speak to Frank Haviland, editor at The New Conservative, on Labour's shallow election victory and the grim rise of Muslim sectarianism.
I think this is actually the story of the election campaign itself, and obviously it's one that the mainstream media doesn't really want to touch.
Special guest David Frost, the Conservative peer and former chief Brexit negotiator, for a deep dive into what the Tories' calamitous defeat means for the future of the party and British politics.
We cannot be social liberals and social conservatives at the same time. We have to choose.
And for those of you donating £5 or more to the Daily Sceptic, our bonus interview this week is with the Daily Sceptic's editor-in-chief, Toby Young, on his trip down under to spearhead a global movement for free speech.
One thing that people have told me about in New Zealand and Australia is a kind of climate of fear.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month to the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. So, 14 years of Conservative government came to an end last Thursday as Keir Starmer's Labour Party secured a landslide victory in the general election. And while that was the expected outcome, there's still a lot to chew over about the results. So to do that, I'm very pleased to be joined first by Frank Haviland, editor at The New Conservative. Welcome, Frank.
Thanks for having me on, Laurie.
Now, first things first. Labour won 412 seats with 34% of the vote. And that's a landslide, no one can deny that. But how strong of a mandate is it? Labour did end up underperforming the polls in terms of seats and vote share, securing just a third of votes in a low turnout election. And so while many will be pleased that the Tories are out and that 14 years of uninspiring rule has come to an end, how does this result reflect on the popularity of Labour as an alternative?
Yeah, well, I think it's about as convincing as Corbyn's Taylor, basically. Exactly as you said, I thought any reasonable Labour government, I mean, if you had Tony Blair at the helm, he'd have probably broken 500 seats, in my opinion. It was the biggest open goal in history. The Tories are almost certainly the most hated administration there's ever been. They performed the worst in 2 centuries. You've got Reform. I mean, they take Labour votes, but they're basically splitting the right-wing vote. And there's no one else to vote for. So if the electorate were going to go anywhere, they were going to go for Starmer, who led basically a non-campaign. He carried the Ming vase. He didn't drop it. So credit to him. But as you say, so 34% of the votes, that's bad. That's not Tony Blair territory. I think that's worse than Corbyn. And Corbyn must be looking at that, kicking himself, because why didn't he come along, 5 years later when his particular brand of terrorist appeasement and anti-Semitism or what looks like anti-Semitism, he'd have been, I think Corbyn would have done better. There's lots of other indications that Starmer really didn't perform well. The first is his own polling. So I think it was something like he lost half of his vote share. It was something like 36,000, went down to 18,000. And there's reasons for that. He had someone standing against him on a Gars ticket. But still, that's the guy that you want for PM. That's not a good look. The Tories should have been absolutely annihilated. I had a bet on that they would get under 100 seats. So obviously, I'm upset. I thought they'd get close to 50. Because what was the reason to vote? Unless you were dyed-in-the-wool, true blue Tory, you couldn't have a reason to vote Conservative. There was no chance. There was absolutely zero chance they were going to win. And the I think it was Lord Ashcroft polling of the Labour voters, it's something like just under a third think Starmer and Labour are going to be a safe pair of hands at the tiller. 43% against, I think it's something like 5% agreed with their policies. I mean, all right, they didn't actually mention many policies, but 48% just wanted the Tories out. And the worst thing is that I think 60% said they were lending Labour their vote. So all the people that think Starmer's in for 2 terms, I wouldn't bet money on it. If you can't reduce the Tories to a rump, then it's never going to be done. So Starmer's in. You know, he didn't actually say anything. He done well, but I'm not convinced. I don't think the electorate is in love with Starmer.
Indeed. Okay, so let's move on to the party that were turfed out. The Tories got 121 seats with 24% of the vote. What went so wrong for them in government?
Yeah, I've been waiting a long time to say this. I suppose there's 2 answers. There's a short answer and a longer answer. The short answer is they're not Conservative. And I think names matter. If you're going to call yourself the Conservative and Unionist Party, however you want to play it, you might need to have a few Conservative policies. But if you're going to govern as Labour Light for 14 years, there's going to be some kickback. That's what the New Conservatives about. That's what Reform's about. Because the electorate is saying, okay, we keep voting for you. And when it comes to election time and you're writing a manifesto, they know exactly what conservatism is. We've got our sovereignty from Brexit. We want the borders closed. We want taxes maybe down a little bit. That would be nice. We want the government out of our pocket. We don't want all this wokery. We don't really want net zero. Get out of our lives and let us get on with doing what we're supposed to do. And they're in a funny way, I think they're one of the reasons why the electorate is not worried about Starmer, because they're just thinking, well, how much worse can it be? What are you doing with this inability to close the borders as a sovereign country? I mean, I could have that solved in a week. Put the Navy in the Channel, take the boats back to France, whether they like it or not. The border force, well, put them on the dole because they're not doing their job. Civil servants don't want to do it. They're working from home 2 days a week anyway, so you kick them out. Or I think you have to say, and credit to people like Suella Braverman, who comes out and says, we know what's going on, we know we failed. They've got to be straight with the public and after 3 to 6 months, just resign and say, I'm getting, Sunak is not doing what we need to do, or Jeremy Hunt won't do it because they want GDP to go up. But if you're going to go in, 80-seat majority, 2019. Nigel Farage, credit to him, stood aside. Let's get Brexit done. Let's do what we need to do. And you're not going to do anything conservative, then you deserve everything you got. And that's what they got. They got a kicking. The only downside, I think, to this election is that I think they really needed to get basically annihilated, because then they would have been forced to rise from the ashes and say, okay, let's actually live up to our name and be conservative. 122 seats? Maybe there's a lot of those MPs that are left are the wets. They can say, well, maybe we should have Jeremy Hunt in charge. Maybe we should play from the centre ground. So that's a worry. But they deserved everything they got, basically. The longer answer is there's other factors. We had COVID, wasn't handled well. I think Boris's initial take on that was the right one. Basically, trust the people. If you need to stay at home, stay at home. But we've got to let the country, people have to go to work, basically. We had Partygate. I think that was blown out of proportion a bit, but that's not good. And then the campaign. I mean, from the Rishi Sunak crying in the rain and the taking bets on whether you're going to lose your seat is just, you couldn't, if you were writing a satire piece, you couldn't satire it. So they got what they deserved.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned Nigel Farage there, and let's go on to talk about reform, shall we? So they got 14% of the vote, despite being sort of wrong-footed by the election being called somewhat early. Now, Nigel Farage wasn't originally going to stand, then he stood in Clacton and won his seat, and they ended up with some 4 million votes and 5 MPs, in fact. And as for their campaign, they tried with some success to make it the immigration election, although that was derailed a bit towards the end. But how do you see the significance of Reform's election campaign and them as a political force going forward for the next 5 years?
Yeah, I think basically Farage did pretty much as well as could be expected with first past the post. I mean, 5 MPs. If you'd have told him that 4 weeks ago, he'd have bit your hand off. 14.3%. I think he got just under 100 second places. And I think there's a piece out in the Telegraph saying that if he got 340,000 more votes, he would have got more votes than the Conservative and would technically have been the official opposition, although, of course, they wouldn't have won that many more seats. So it's a phenomenal achievement. It's not what I predicted. Everything in this election didn't quite come out as TNC predicted. So like Labour didn't smash it as well as they should. Reform didn't quite get, I had them, I mean, the exit polls were, 13, 14 seats. I thought they might even get more. But obviously that shows that's the problem with first past the post and how close they were. 1 more percentage point, they probably would have got a fair few more seats. They were derailed. And I think that needs looking at because Farage is one of the best communicators, but there was either a lot of very dirty tricks going on. So the Channel 4 sting.
We've gone undercover inside Nigel Farage's Reform UK campaign in Clacton. And
how much of that was genuine and how much of that was a stitch-up is, I don't know. It's probably been looked at. But you could see the coincidences there were pretty impressive. The Russia comments, I mean, these were things he said 10 years ago. He was basically proved to be right. It looks like, or certainly it's a reasonable argument to say, and many other people like Boris Johnson have said the same thing. But again, it was very easy for opponents to blow that out of all proportion. I think 5 seats is a good tally, and they're good. I mean, Lee Anderson returned is good. I'm glad that Richard Tice got his seat. I think he deserves that. It's going to be interesting to see how much of a voice they can make, because Farage is known for making his voice heard. I don't know if they get one or if they get any questions at PMQs, but Farage is going to be a pain to both the Tories and Labour. It's going to keep them honest. So it's going to be good to see. I think populism is here to stay. He did put it on the map. I think the last time he tried to stand as an MP, there were all sorts of tricks being played out to stop it. But this time, there was no chance. I mean, I think he got like nearly 50% of the vote. So it's just obvious he was going to do that. It's going to be interesting to see going forward if they can maintain that 14, 15% in the polls. And obviously, the question then is, what do the Tories do? Because there's obviously people like Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, who would probably merge tomorrow. They'd probably have Nigel as running the show if they could. But there's a lot of other people that don't want anything to do with him. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Tories play it. But I think he's here to stay.
Okay, so we got onto there the fact that Reform got just 5 MPs from some 4 million votes. And a lot of people have been saying that it was quite a disproportionate election. So obviously, Labour, as we mentioned, got 412 seats from a third of the vote. Meanwhile, the Lib Dems got some 72 MPs from just 11% of the vote. And I think Sir John Curtis has said that this was one of the most disproportionate elections we've ever had. And that's prompting more calls for potential move to proportional representation. Now, one of the ironies here is that the Lib Dems have long campaigned for that, but in this election, it's actually worked out in their favour, first past the post. But what's your take on that in general? Should we move to PR?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the Lib Dems, that's classic. They are probably less likely to go for PR than they ever have been in their history. I don't know if it was Sir John Curtis or someone said that Reform would have got 93 seats under PR, which that tells you the gulf we're talking about. I haven't really thought about this too much myself. I basically think I'm in favour of first past the post. It's probably going to surprise some people. It's not fair. I mean, life isn't fair, but it is fair in that those are the rules. And there are some benefits of first past the post. The first thing is you get a clear winner. Everyone knows what the rules are when they go into it. You have to get the most votes in the seat. I know there's a lot of gerrymandering that goes on from time to time. But basically, you know the game you're playing. That's number one. Number two is if you're going to have PR, you've got problems that come with that, which is that you've got the problem of extremism, which probably we're going to get to later, that maybe you don't want. It suits the two-party system, which maybe there's not much between them. Maybe we could argue about that. There's other issues, though. I mean, you want your MP working for you in the constituency. You want him to be based there, or him or her to be based there, and to know what the voters want. If you can have PR, the MP may not care at all about where he's working. So I totally understand the calls for PR, but I think it's you can't just approach these things from the way it suits you. So, for example, I think lots of people in Labour have often said they're in favour of PR. Post-election, there is zero chance of Labour going for PR. They've just got 412 seats. They're very happy. Sir Ed Davey, I don't think he's going to be bungee jumping for PR anytime soon. So I doubt that's going to be on the docket, but I get that it's unfair. And the other thing, of course, is that you get what you get in lots of Europe. You get sort of weak coalition governments where, again, the MPs and the government you elect are compromised and they're not going to deliver. Now, obviously, the Conservatives didn't deliver anything that they promised, but we can live in hope. So I think I'd come down in favour of first past the post, but I get it. It's a tricky issue. Maybe Farage can push for a referendum, but I seem to remember that they had one before, and I think it was very clearly won in favour of first past the post. So I don't see it happening.
So one of the uglier features of this election is the seeming rise of sectarianism. So there have been numerous independent MPs in heavily Muslim areas elected on strictly pro-Gaza platforms. And this has been particularly affecting Labour MPs. So Jonathan Ashworth notably lost his seat in Leicester South, Wes Streeting almost lost his, and Jess Phillips has had a very toxic campaign against her in Birmingham Yardley. She was heckled by a pro-Gaza crowd at her victory speech, and she's described this weekend young women canvassers of hers having genocide screamed in their faces, and one of them having their tyres slashed. Now, while it may be a minority of Muslims doing this, that's clearly where it's been coming from. But what's been striking about this is that Phillips has been keen to emphasise that it wasn't Muslims doing this per se, it was idiots, or it was men berating women. And this sort of speaks to a wider reluctance in the commentariat to talk about what the problem really is here, namely Islamism. So what do you think about this issue as a whole, and also the fact that much of our media and political class refuses to talk about it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think this is actually the story of the election campaign itself. And obviously it's one that the mainstream media doesn't really want to touch. They love their euphemisms. People on a pro-Gaza ticket or whatever. This is Muslim extremism. We need to call it out for what it is. And there's a delicious irony that the left is now coming face to face, having lit the multicultural fuse. They're coming face to face with the ramifications, just like everyone else in their constituencies. Particularly people like Jess Phillips and Jonathan Ashworth. I think he was on Question Time orating the terrible racist Brexit voters who thought this had anything to do with Islam. Jess Phillips, exactly as you said. I think the closest she came to calling it out was maybe on a Sky interview, and she called them these people, which has just great overtones about it. It's a couple of things here are very clear. The first thing is that I think the Muslim vote is almost, and I think they were caught on the hop as well with the 4-week campaign. They couldn't quite get prepared, but the Muslim vote is almost ready to go it alone. They had a problem before. They tried setting up what was it, the Party of Islam, I think it was. They didn't get past the Electoral Commission. But they won't be making that mistake for 5 years. They'll sort that out. And the demographics are only going one way. And I think the Muslim vote has been happy to have some kind of parasitic relationship with Labour as long as they get their own way. But to a certain point, they're going to go it alone. They don't need Labour. And I think you're starting to see that the expectation, again, that I had, and I was slightly off, was that the Gaza vote, to use the euphemism, was maybe going to cost Starmer 20 seats. It didn't quite get there, but we had 5 seats, if you count Corbyn, and I think you should. And as you say, there were 4 or 5 others where they, probably more than that, where they decided. I mean, Ian Duncan Smith holding on to his seat was insane because the pro-Gaza candidate split the Labour vote, and Ian Duncan Smith got in. I mean, that's nice. I like him, but that's not going to happen in 5 years. They're going to get their act together. The problem here is that Labour has milked this vote. I think in 2019 there were probably 86% of Muslims voted Labour. That's down significantly. It's probably, I think it's low 60s, but in the heavily Muslim areas, in Muslim seats with 40% of the vote, I think it was down 33 or 39%. I can't remember. That's staggering. And more to the point, what on earth has Gaza to do with UK elections? Yes, it's a big deal, but we do know why that's the case. Of all the injustices in the world, why do you have to pick that one? Why are there not hundreds of thousands of people campaigning out in London every weekend for the Ukraine war? That's pretty bad. You got innocent people dying there. Why is no one worrying about slavery in Africa? Why? And it's a Muslim issue, okay? Why are they not worried about the Uyghurs in China? We know why they're not worried, because this one concerns Israel. And, Israel got attacked. It was live streamed. It was just a terrible genocidal atrocity. And yet Israel had the temerity to defend itself. And the reason, one of the reasons I think that the left particularly doesn't want to call it out, obviously they don't want to lose the votes, is that Islam is given a free ride in everything. There's this not all Muslims canard, but no one else needs to have that nuance. UKIP voters didn't get that. They were all racists and fruitcakes and loonies. Brexit voters didn't get that. Reform voters didn't get that. And Tories don't get that. White men don't get that. This is not a minority view. I think it's 75% of British Muslims don't think Hamas committed murder or committed genocide in Israel. Over 50% are vehemently against homosexuality. Over 50, or I think it's close to 50%, believe that Jews have too much power. That the issue here is that it's Israel, and we know what that issue is, and that should not be a feature of UK politics, but it is. And one of the main reasons is because Tony Blair opened the borders, and the Tories have done nothing to stop it, and the demographics are only going one way. So we can expect more, not less of this. And I think in 2029, the Muslim vote's going to be a powerful bloc. It's probably going to have its own party, and Starmer will be worried about it. And what worries me is that he's going to be compromised.
Absolutely. Well, Frank Haviland, thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Laurie.
Now, in terms of finding out what life will be like under a Starmer government, it's still early days. The Tories, meanwhile, are licking their wounds from their defeat, and they're having to ask themselves the big questions of what went wrong and where do they go from here. Well, joining me now to answer some of those questions is our special guest this week, David Frost, Lord Frost of Allington, the Conservative peer and former diplomat and chief Brexit negotiator under Boris Johnson. Welcome, David.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's talk about the general election. Tories have had a historically bad election result, and partly they didn't have a great campaign, but that certainly wasn't the only reason they did poorly. So to start with, what do you think are the main lessons the Conservatives need to learn from this calamitous election defeat?
So the first thing we need to learn is why we lost. And in my view, there's a fairly clear answer to that we didn't have a sufficiently clear proposition. We didn't have sufficiently clear Conservative policies that could attract people. We've lost over half the votes we got in 2019. Some of them have gone left. Most of them have gone to Reform or people just sitting on their hands and refusing to come out and vote for us. And we need to find a way of getting both of those groups back. The starting point is to try and bring back Conservatives, and then to convince people that our ideas are the right ones to build a coalition a bit more broadly. So I think that's the heart of the problem. We had not only drifted a bit left, but our proposition had become kind of insubstantial, hard to read, hard to understand, extremely broad and blurred. And of course, we didn't deliver what we said we were going to deliver. And all those things together were fatal. You're right that the campaign itself was really just the icing on the cake, if that's the right metaphor. It isn't really. We could have made things slightly better through a better campaign. I don't think it could have dealt with the structural problems that we face.
And so on those structural problems, you say the message has been too broad. Is that a consequence of the ideological factions within the party being too various?
I mean, the party does seem to be, made up of quite a constellation of ideological factions nowadays. I don't think it's. That's not particularly unusual, but it's the breadth of the factions that's been a problem, and it sometimes feels like there's no proposition that you can't find somebody in the Conservative Party who will support it. We cannot be social liberals and social conservatives at the same time. We can't be free marketeers and proponents of industrial policy and the active and all-knowing state at the same time. We have to choose if we're to be convincing to people. And the problem is, we've just become so broad. We've got people who represent all these different views. And it's become unmanageable. It's become hard to explain what we stand for. And there we are.
Yes. And so there are lots of different splits within the party, but that key one being between the social conservatives on the one hand and the social liberals on the other. And it's interesting to look at what effect the election has had on that split. And so, for instance, some people on the left of the party are out, so Penny Mordaunt, Grant Shapps, Alex Chalk, Gillian Keegan, for example, but then so are Liz Truss and Jacob Rees-Mogg. And then at the same time, some on the right of the party have held their seats, like Robert Jenrick and Suella Braverman, but then again, Alicia Kearns and Caroline Noakes are still in. And then finally, there's 27 MPs in the new intake who are something of an unknown quantity. So with all that, how do you think the election has affected the ideological balance within the party?
Well, I think, you're right to point out people, there are people who remain and there are people who have been kicked out from both sides of the party. And there's quite a lot of unknowns in there as well. I tend to think the party kind of tilts a bit social liberal left, but possibly only slightly now in the parliamentary party. And of course, the effect of this shattering defeat on people may have been to change their mind. We can't take the past necessarily as a guide to the future. People may come to think differently and learn from experience. I hope so, certainly. But I think it certainly opens the possibility that we will continue the infighting. That we will not be able to settle what the party stands for unless we show, a degree more, quite a lot more, not so much discipline, but ability to unite around a agreed philosophy and to project it. And that's what we have failed to do. There's no point in calling for discipline if there are fundamental disagreements about what should be done and what should we stand for. It simply won't last. We've got to do the hard work of deciding which sort of bits of conservatism we stand for and starting to project them. And, it could be that is quite difficult.
Yeah. And so just in terms of that new intake, obviously the 29 intake was a lot of red wall MPs. And the philosophy they were supposed to be bringing was sort of about the Brexit realignment, was about social conservatism and maybe still leaning a little bit left on the economy. But if that was the sort of general philosophy of the 2019 intake, the realignment, perhaps it wasn't fulfilled, but in any case, that's what it was supposed to be bringing to the party. What do you think the ideological lesson of the 2024 intake will be?
It's hard to tell because, and also, in my experience, quite a lot of Conservatives are relatively open on these ideological questions and go with what the leadership wants or what appears to be succeeding. And, of course, a big problem with the Sunak leadership and strategy was that it was failing. Our polls were going down rather than up. It was obviously failing, and that's what caused so much concern. So success breeds its own supporters. Obviously, we're a very long way from that at the moment, but we can get back there. I do think that we made a mistake with how we interpreted the Red Wall and the realignment in 2019. There was this sense that a lot of people had that we had brought in a lot of formerly Labour supporters into the party, and therefore we needed to have sort of sub-Labour policies to keep them happy. And I think that was a misinterpretation. What happened in the realignment was that a lot of voters who were Conservatives by every marker of their lives other than who they voted for finally came over to us. Their lifestyles were Conservative, their aspirations were Conservative, the way they wanted to live was Conservative. It's just that the hangover from the Thatcher period, deindustrialisation, the unpopularity of the Conservative brand was finally overcome by Brexit and Corbyn. And then we didn't offer them Conservative policies. We didn't offer them what they had come over for. We offered them what they'd left. So it's not surprising that the message got blurred and we failed. So that's why I keep coming back to we must stick to our Conservative philosophy. And that doesn't mean a tilt to the right, to another narrow bit of the spectrum. It means mainstream conservatism, free markets, the nation, social conservatism, freedom of speech, the things we've always stood for, things that are actually quite popular in the country still. It's just the Conservative Party that is not popular. Those are the things we've got to get back to somehow, refresh the brand and get back on the front foot. And it's easy to say, it's going to be very difficult in practice, but that's what we've got to try and do, I think.
Okay, so you mentioned that part of the reason the message isn't coming through is because of the leadership. So let's get onto that question now, shall we? It's perhaps too early to ask you to endorse a specific candidate, but what kind of things should people be looking for a future leader of the Conservative Party, in your view?
Yeah, I think it's a bit soon to start talking about individuals. We all know who might come forward on the right and indeed on the left of the party. We'll have to see who actually does come forward. For me, the important thing is that they want to do the task that I've just described and can credibly represent it. They look like they believe it, they want to do it, they can motivate people, they can cut through the noise, which is obviously kind of crucial in opposition, are in it for that long haul. I'm not desperate to rush this, I must say. I mean, I do think that those who created the disaster need to get off the stage as quickly as they can, I'm afraid. But I don't see what would be so terrible about having an interim leader for a few months, 6 months till Christmas, say. The Labour Party has done it in similar circumstances, doesn't seem to cause a problem. So I think we need to give ourselves the time to make sure we're happy with where we go, that the issues are properly debated, that we really understand the character, the determination, the beliefs of whoever finally gets the job, and also of the consequences of choosing one person against another in terms of the ideological split in the party. All that I don't think can be rushed. The truth is, nobody's going to be paying any attention to what the Conservative Party thinks about anything for a bit. That's just the brutal reality. Attention is on Labour. There's very little we can do to stop Labour doing what they want to do at the moment. So we need to use the time constructively for ourselves, choose the right person, get the right ideas, start rebuilding. And if that takes 6 months, that seems fine as far as I'm concerned.
But so the vacuum that might create for a little while will be a good opportunity for Nigel Farage and Reform to make their mark on Parliament. And obviously Farage has spoken about wanting to be the real leader of the opposition. So firstly, how much cut through do you think they will get with that? And then from the perspective of the Conservative Party, how will that influence their coming leadership selection process?
We've got to wait and see, obviously, and see what they do. Nigel Farage obviously has big ambitions to be an effective opposition. I'm sure we'll hear a lot from them in the in the Commons. They don't have anybody in the Lords yet, of course. Let's see how that plays out. I think, it will influence our leadership campaign and our policy refresh, rethink, however you want to describe it. It's a bit hard to see how at the moment. I think the Reform Manifesto was, in my view, a pretty good Conservative manifesto. There were things in it that maybe didn't quite hang together. There were things I wouldn't have done personally, but I think in general it was perfectly recognisable Conservative manifesto. And, we have got to show, if we want to take on reform, that we're willing to occupy that ground somehow. If we move further away from it, if we try and fight them without being Conservatives ourselves, I think all that will happen is we'll open up the ground in the way that you describe. It'll become even easier for reform to fill the gap that we left. So, in all this period, in the next few months, but also beyond that, we've got to show that we are Conservatives. I think the ideal would be that we and Reform in the short run were kind of advocating rather similar kinds of opposition to the Labour government. And, how it plays out, whether it plays out by cooperation or merger, or whether it plays out by us simply becoming more Conservative again and taking away Reform voters, one way or another, the right has got to get reunited again. We simply won't win any elections with two competing parties, and it's not fair to our voters to make them choose between two parties with similar propositions. We've got to get that right. These next 6 months, and which leader we choose, how they want to handle reform, what they say about Nigel Farage, that is going to set the tone for the rest of the Parliament. And that's one reason why I think it's so important to take the time and debate it and get it right.
So you said really you should be occupying quite similar ground. And so what do you say to those in your party who say, on the contrary to that what the Conservatives should be doing to reform is just denouncing them and sort of distancing yourselves from them and shifting more towards the left or the centre? And the reason perhaps that the Conservatives have gone so wrong is that they've been too populist.
Well, I don't agree with it. I think we... if we move further to the social liberal left, then all we're doing is opening up a wider and wider space for reform. That's not the same thing as saying, all we need to do is move to the right and exactly occupy reform's space. That's not right either. We've got to try and create a broad coalition around a clear Conservative philosophy and be so clear in what that stands for, make it look so attractive, be so effective in advocating it, that the broad mass of Conservative voters and parliamentarians want to go along with that. I think some on the left of the party perhaps never will. I think they're too social liberal or too economically leftist, really to fit in to a genuinely Conservative party. But I still do think that genuinely Conservative party can be quite broad. I don't see why, I don't think that many in the One Nation group have fundamentally different philosophies to mainstream conservatism. They've just been kind of beaten by the last 20 years of endlessly tracking left and endlessly trying to capture the centre and haven't been offered an alternative route forward. If we can get a proper Conservative philosophy, proper diagnosis of the problems, proper explanation of why Conservative policies are best in dealing with them, then I think we can bring most people along with us behind that. They're desperate for an alternative, I think, a lot of voters, and we just have not offered that meaningfully. So I don't give up at all. I don't see the party as fundamentally riven between One Nation and everybody else. I think there are fringes at either end, but it's perfectly possible to unite them behind a strong, genuinely Conservative philosophy that can make a difference.
Right. And so let's turn to Labour now. So obviously Keir Starmer has this reputation as a kind of boring technocrat, But we've been talking a lot on this show recently about how, despite that, if you actually look under the bonnet of Labour's plans, a lot of them are quite radical, particularly this New Britain document that Gordon Brown drew up for Labour in 2022. So there's things like going ahead with more devolution, including regional assemblies. There's the Race Equality Act. There's the socioeconomic duty they want to bring in. There's the fiscal lock. And so it's more power to the quangos. And one of the concerns is that this will be a constitutional revolution from which it's almost impossible to recover if you're a reforming right-wing party coming in after a Starmer government. So do you share those concerns?
Yeah, I mean, you describe it very well. I think that, technocracy can be, just as dangerous as conventional Corbynite far leftism, just in a different way. And that's what we are going to see, I fear. We're going to see, kind of high levels of regulation, high levels of general kind of nannying and telling people what to do. And we're going to see a doubling down on this sort of Bantustan group rights regime that's being created through the Equality Act and beyond it. And, as you say, quite possibly some constitutional reform on the lines of the Brown paper. Now, none of that is irreversible, and I don't agree with those who say, Labour will create a kind of constitutional monstrosity that we'll never be able to get out of. I'm very wary of such predictions. I think there's every reason to think we can win the 28-29 election behind a good Conservative philosophy. And if we do, we need to know what we're going to do about the technocratic quango state. We can dismantle it overnight with a few bits of legislation if we want to, with a decent majority. No parliament can bind its successor. We just have to have the will. And we've just not had the will over the last few years to reverse the Blairite changes. So they're now going to get worse. But I don't think there's no reason to think we can't reverse them. We just need to have confidence that that's what we want to do. That's what's necessary for the country. We don't have to acquiesce in this sort of endless Europeanization of the way we govern ourselves, which is what a lot of it's about. And we can do it differently. We just need to decide that's what we're going to do and do it when we next get elected. And, that will not be easy. We need to have a very clear plan. We need to start doing it now, but it can be done, and we need to start squaring up for that.
Yeah. And so just on that question of political will, I mean, it seems so far that this new Labour government that's come in, they have a clear plan of what they want to do and they're moving ahead with it quite rapidly. Is there a lesson there for the Conservatives in terms of their willingness to just get things done?
Yeah, I think we lost confidence towards the end in our ability to kind of do anything. And, things like the constant back and forth over fracking, the very traumatic vote over that in the Liz Truss era, for example, kind of shows that we just lost the ability to drive through controversial things against opposition. Let's see. Labour have done. They've reversed the planning ban on wind farms. They've brought in one or two other things quickly. The planning reform more broadly. Let's see. It's very early days, obviously, and they've got a bigger majority than we have. But I've no doubt there'll be some opposition. I think they are more culturally attuned to just using the state to get things done than we have been, because we still have in our DNA a bit this idea that you shouldn't unnecessarily interfere with civil society and governments shouldn't direct everything. The effect of that has actually been just to give power to kind of quangos and blockers and everybody who wanted to stop things, rather than creating a genuinely free civil society that could decide things for itself. So I do think Labour are more attuned to it. I think we'll see them use state power more than we were able to or wish to. And we'll have to get a bit over that, clearly, if we're going to reverse some of the changes, if we do win again. But that doesn't mean a bigger state, a more directive state. It means using the power of the state to free up society, create more freedom, create more choice, and more liberalism. That's the paradox. We need to use state power to achieve these non-state ends.
Okay, well, I think that's all we've got time for. Lord Frost, thanks for coming on.
Great. Pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailysceptic.org/donate.